Few civilizations in the recorded history of the world have managed to sustain themselves with the kind of coherence, continuity, and cultural intensity that ancient Egypt achieved over the course of more than 3,000 years. From the earliest agricultural settlements along the banks of the Nile to the last of the pharaonic dynasties, Egypt presents historians, archaeologists, and scholars with something genuinely rare. A civilization that did not merely endure, but one that returned again and again to a recognizable version of itself even after periods of collapse, foreign occupation, and internal fragmentation. To understand how that was possible, one must not begin with the pyramids or the pharaohs, but with the river that made all of it conceivable in the first place. The Nile was not simply a geographic feature of ancient Egypt. It was the organizing principle of the entire civilization. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described Egypt as the gift of the Nile, and while that phrase has become something of a cliché over the centuries, it captures a truth that goes far deeper than poetic observation. Every year, without fail, the Nile flooded its banks, retreated, and left behind a layer of dark, mineral-rich silt across the floodplain that transformed what otherwise would have been uninhabitable desert into some of the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world. The Egyptians were so attuned to the rhythms of the Nile that they built stone instruments called nilometers specifically to measure the height of the annual flood, because the difference between an insufficient flood and an excessive one could mean the difference between famine and catastrophic inundation. The flood level also determined taxation. In years of high water and abundant harvest, the state collected more. In lean years, less. A system that required remarkable administrative sophistication to maintain. What emerges from this relationship between river and civilization is a portrait of a people who were, at their most fundamental level, not merely the builders of monuments, but the managers of water, and whose extraordinary achievements in architecture, art, religion, and governance were made possible by the agricultural surplus that the Nile reliably generated. Long before there were dynasties or pharaohs or hieroglyphs, there were people living along the Nile Valley in small, semi-permanent settlements, farming the floodplain, herding the cattle, and genuinely developing the material and social complexity that would eventually coalesce into one of the world's great civilizations. Archaeological work across the Fayum Basin, the Nile Delta, and Upper Egypt has uncovered evidence of these pre-dynastic cultures, each one representing a distinct phase of development, each one building on the achievements of what came before. The Naqada culture, which flourished roughly between 4000 and 3150 BCE, represents the most sophisticated of these pre-dynastic societies and is directly ancestral to dynastic Egypt. Toward the end of this period, distinct city-states began to emerge in Upper Egypt, each with its own ruling class, its own local gods, and its own ambitions, and the archaeological record from this era includes the earliest surviving examples of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, found on pottery, bone, and ivory objects at Abydos, suggesting that writing emerged not as a literary or religious tool, but as an administrative one, a means of recording ownership, transaction, and identity in an increasingly complex society where memory alone was no longer sufficient. Around 3150 BCE, the two major territories of Upper and Lower Egypt, each with its own crown, its own regalia, and its own traditions, were brought under a single ruler known to history as Nama, who is widely regarded as the founder of the first dynasty and the first pharaoh of a unified Egyptian state. The early dynastic period that followed was a time of consolidation, experimentation, and cultural formation. The institution of divine kingship, the idea that the pharaoh was not merely a political ruler, but the earthly embodiment of the god Horus, and upon death the god Osiris, took shape during this period and would remain the ideological foundation of Egyptian governance for the next 3,000 years. It was during the Third Dynasty, however, that Egyptian civilization took one of its most consequential architectural leaps. King Djoser commissioned his chief architect and vizier Imhotep to design a funerary monument at Saqqara that would surpass anything that had come before it. The result was the Step Pyramid, a structure built by stacking 6 mastabas one on top of another in diminishing sizes, creating a tiered tower of stone that rose 62 meters above the desert and became the tallest building in the world at the time of its construction. What makes the Step Pyramid remarkable is not merely its size, but the fact that it was built entirely of stone at a scale never previously attempted, introducing principles of construction that would be refined and perfected over the following centuries. Imhotep himself became one of the most extraordinary figures of the ancient world. Revered as a physician and sage during his lifetime, he was deified after his death and worshipped as a god of medicine across Egypt and eventually in the Greek world, where he was identified with Asclepius. The fact that an architect and administrator could achieve divine status speaks to the Egyptian belief that exceptional human achievement was a form of divine expression, that the gods worked through gifted individuals, leaving traces of the sacred in acts of creation that outlasted their creators by millennia. The Old Kingdom, spanning roughly from 2613 to 2181 BCE, represents what many historians consider the apex of pharaonic power and the most concentrated expression of Egypt's architectural genius. Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty, was essentially the inventor of the true pyramid, arriving at the final form through a process of systemic trial and architectural revision that is itself remarkable as a historical record. His pyramid at Medium eventually collapsed due to structural miscalculation. His bent pyramid at Dashur preserves in its changing angle the precise moment when engineers recognized mid-construction that their original slope was too steep. His red pyramid, the 3rd attempt, was Egypt's first successful true pyramid, built on stable foundations at a consistent angle and demonstrating that the principle could be executed without structural failure. What is notable about Sneferu is not just the extraordinary resources he committed to pyramid construction, but the institutional willingness to learn from failure that those resources imply. Khufu, Sneferu's son and successor, built the Great Pyramid at Giza over approximately 20 years, marshalling a workforce of tens of thousands of skilled and unskilled laborers who were, as the archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates, employees of the state rather than enslaved workers. The workers' village excavated near the Giza Plateau revealed bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and administrative buildings, indicating that the state invested substantially in the welfare of the people who built its monuments. Workers received regular rations of bread, beer, and meat, and the graffiti they left on stone blocks, boastful team names like Friends of Khufu, suggest a workforce that took genuine pride in its contribution. The ancient accounts of brutal slave labor at Giza have no archaeological support whatsoever, and the reality of the pyramid construction is in many ways more impressive than the myth, a highly organized, professionally managed construction enterprise that represented the full mobilization of a sophisticated state apparatus. It is worth pausing here to consider the social world that existed in the shadow of the pyramids, because ancient Egyptian society was considerably more layered and dynamic than the image of a single omnipotent pharaoh commanding silent masses might suggest. At the base of the social structure were the peasant farmers, who worked land owned by the crown, the temples, or the nobility, and who contributed their labor to state construction projects during the annual flood season when their fields were underwater. Above them were skilled craftsmen, scribes, and administrators, a middle tier that was far more numerous and socially mobile than is often appreciated. Skilled painters, sculptors, and engravers were among the most valued workers in Egyptian society, paid substantially more than unskilled laborers, and in high demand for the constant program of tomb decoration, temple construction, and monument carving that the state's ideological requirements generated. The scribal class occupied a particularly important position, since literacy was the gateway to administrative power, and a talented young man of modest origins who could read and write had access to a career path that might eventually place him in proximity to the pharaoh himself. Egyptian literary texts aimed at young students frequently emphasized the advantages of the scribal profession over manual trades, painting vivid pictures of the hardships of farming, soldiering, and craftwork, in contrast to the comfortable, respected life of the educated official, a form of career guidance that would not feel entirely out of place in a modern context. The reason for the Old Kingdom's eventual collapse in the late 6th dynasty can be broadly summarized as a cumulative erosion of central authority through the systemic redistribution of wealth and power to the priesthood and to regional governors known as nomarchs. Over generations, pharaohs had rewarded loyal officials and religious institutions with tax exemptions and royal land grants, and these accumulated into a substantial transfer of economic power away from the crown. When Pepi II ascended to the throne as a child and ruled for nearly 90 years, there was no generation of administrators who remembered a time of stronger central authority and no effective mechanism for reversing the trend. When reduced Nile floods brought famine to the country in his later years, the decentralized state was incapable of mounting a coordinated response, and the social and political order of the Old Kingdom dissolved into what historians call the First Intermediate Period, roughly 2181 to 2055 BCE, an era in which regional traditions flourished, artistic styles diversified, and access to religious resources that had previously been reserved for royalty spread downward through the social hierarchy. Before we continue, if you are finding this journey through ancient Egypt as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. We cover the full sweep of human history in this kind of depth every week, and there is a great deal more of Egypt's story still to tell. The reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II of Thebes, around 2055 BCE, inaugurated the Middle Kingdom, a period that many Egyptologists regard as the most administratively sophisticated in Egyptian history. The 12th dynasty in particular represents a high point of state organization with a system of co-regency, in which a designated heir would rule alongside the reigning king before assuming sole authority that ensured smooth transfers of power across generations. Among the most impressive achievements of the Middle Kingdom was the large-scale hydraulic engineering undertaken in the Fayum Basin, where a system of dikes and canals were constructed to redirect Nile floodwater into Lake Moeris, turning a vast area of previously marginal land into productive farmland. This project reflects a capacity for long-term state planning that goes well beyond the Old Kingdom's monument-building program. It was not a monument to royal ego, but a practical investment in food security and economic productivity of the state, and its agricultural benefits were felt for generations after the engineers who designed it were long forgotten. The Middle Kingdom also produced some of the finest literature in Egyptian language, including the story of Sinuyi, a narrative of exile and return that exhibits a psychological complexity and emotional range rarely associated with ancient Egyptian writing, as well as various wisdom texts and philosophical dialogues that suggest a culture capable of genuine intellectual self-reflection. These texts reveal an Egypt that was not merely the hierarchic ceremonial civilization of popular imagination, but a society in which questions about individual identity, moral responsibility, and the nature of a well-lived life were subjects of serious literary explanation, written down, copied, and studied by generations of scribal students as models of both language and thought. The Middle Kingdom's collapse followed a pattern disturbingly similar to that of the Old Kingdom, with the weakening of central authority creating the conditions for external disruption. The Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands as Egyptians called them, had been migrating into the Nile Delta for generations, and by the time the 13th dynasty recognized the scale of the problem, the Hyksos were already established themselves as the dominant political power in Lower Egypt. What is remarkable about this development is how thoroughly they adopted Egyptian cultural forms. They took Egyptian titles, worshipped Egyptian gods, and administered their territory according to Egyptian bureaucratic conventions. What they introduced into Egypt, however, proved more consequential than what they took away. The horse-drawn war chariot, the composite bow, bronze weaponry, all arrived through the Hyksos' presence. When the Theban rulers of Upper Egypt finally expelled the Hyksos, a campaign completed by Ahmose I around 1550 BCE, they did so using the very military technology that the Hyksos had introduced. Ahmose's victory created the ideological and military foundation for something entirely new, an Egyptian empire built upon the conviction that Egypt's security required the permanent projection of power beyond its borders. The New Kingdom, stretching from approximately 1550 to 1070 BCE, was Egypt at its most expansionist and culturally complex. Among its most remarkable figures was Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh for approximately 20 years, commissioning monuments and expeditions at a scale that matches the achievements of any male pharaoh of her era. Her mortuary temple at Deir al-Bahri remains one of the most architecturally sophisticated buildings of the ancient world, and her sponsorship of a major trading expedition to the land of Punt is documented in relief carvings that constitute one of the most detailed records of an ancient trading mission that has survived anywhere. After her death, her name and image were systematically removed from many of the monuments she had commissioned, an attempted erasure that failed comprehensively, since enough of her records survived to allow modern Egyptologists to reconstruct her reign in considerable detail. Her story is, among other things, a reminder of how fragile historical memory is when it depends upon the goodwill of those that follow. Thutmose III, who led at least 17 military campaigns across roughly 20 years of active warfare, is often regarded as the greatest military strategist in Egyptian history. At the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BCE, facing a coalition of Canaanite city-states, he chose the most direct and dangerous route of approach. A narrow mountain pass his generals strongly advised against, precisely because the audacity of the move would place his forces behind the enemy's defensive positions before they could respond. The gamble succeeded brilliantly, and his subsequent campaign narrative, inscribed on the walls of the great temple of Amun at Karnak, is one of the most detailed accounts of ancient military strategy and logistics that has come down to us. Over the course of his reign, Thutmose extended Egyptian authority from the fourth cataract of the Nile in Nubia to the banks of the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, creating an empire whose geographical extent would never be surpassed by any subsequent Egyptian ruler, and whose wealth funded a transformation of the Theban temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor that permanently altered the architectural landscape of Upper Egypt. The religious revolution of Akhenaten, who declared the sun disk Aten to be the sole legitimate god of Egypt, remains one of the most debated events in ancient history. He closed the temples of all the other gods, moved the capital to an entirely new city built on virgin ground at Amarna, and commissioned an entirely new artistic style that rejected the formal conventions of traditional Egyptian art in favor of a more naturalistic idiom. Whether his motivations were generally theological or primarily political, aimed at breaking the economic power of the Amun priesthood, which by the New Kingdom controlled enough wealth to rival the crown, is a question scholars continue to argue, and the answer is probably that both considerations were present simultaneously. After his death, his successors dismantled the Aten revolution with remarkable thoroughness, and his young son Tutankhamun, who came to the throne at approximately 9 years of age, restored the traditional religion, reopened the temples, and moved the capital back to Memphis. Tutankhamun died at around 18 years of age, and most likely would have been a minor footnote in Egyptian history had Howard Carter not discovered his intact tomb in 1922, producing a treasure of golden artifacts that made him the most famous pharaoh in history, despite the relative insignificance of his actual reign. Ramesses II, who ruled from approximately 1279 to 1213 BCE, a period of 66 years, has become the most widely recognized name in Egyptian history, partly because of the sheer volume of monuments he commissioned, and partly because of the extraordinary narrative of the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, inscribed on the walls of at least 5 major temples. At Kadesh, Ramses led his army into a near-catastrophic ambush by the Hittite king Muwatalli II, and found himself cut off from the main body of his army when the Hittite chariots attacked. Neither side achieved a decisive victory, but what followed the battle is in many ways more historically significant than the battle itself. Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed a formal peace treaty in 1259 BCE, the earliest surviving international peace treaty in recorded history, whose provisions covering mutual non-aggression and military assistance obligations are sophisticated enough to be recognizable as a template for diplomatic agreements made 3,000 years later. That a civilization capable of producing the Great Pyramid was also capable of producing the conceptual framework for international diplomacy is a reminder of how broad and deep the Egyptian contribution to human civilization actually runs. The New Kingdom's final chapter was shaped by the challenge of the Sea Peoples, a confederation of maritime raiders who swept across the eastern Mediterranean in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, destroying the Hittite Empire and eventually turning their attention towards Egypt. Ramses III confronted major invasions by both land and sea, and his innovative naval response, positioning archers on the Nile Delta shoreline to fire on enemy ships and to prevent their crews from disembarking, secured Egypt's borders at enormous cost. The royal treasury was depleted to the point where the state could no longer pay the craftsmen responsible for carving and decorating the royal tombs, and in the 29th year of Ramses III's reign, those workers staged a sit-in at a nearby temple, refusing to return until they received their overdue grain rations. It is the earliest documented labor strike in recorded history, and its occurrence during the reign of a pharaoh portrayed on his temple walls as an all-conquering warrior god is a precise measure of the gap between royal ideology and administrative reality that characterized the later New Kingdom. The decline that followed was neither sudden nor absolute, but it was irreversible. The priesthood of Amun had rebuilt its wealth and influence under the Amarna interlude, and by the late 20th dynasty effectively functioned as a parallel government in Upper Egypt, controlling more land and revenue than the crown. The succession of later Ramses pharaohs played out against a background of tomb robbery, administrative corruption, and factional competition that progressively hollowed out the institutions of central governance. When the last Ramesside pharaoh died around 1070 BCE, Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period, a prolonged era of political fragmentation in which power was divided between competing dynasties ruling from different cities, and in which the concept of a single unified Egypt became more ideological aspiration than political reality. Yet, even in this fractured state, Egyptian culture continued to produce remarkable things. Temples were built, texts were copied, and the traditions of art and religion that had begun developing for 2,000 years continued to evolve and express themselves with genuine vitality. The centuries that followed were not, despite the political fragmentation, simply a long decline. The 25th dynasty, founded by Kushite kings from the Nubian kingdom centered at Napata, represents one of the more remarkable episodes in Egyptian history. A foreign dynasty, more authentically committed to Egyptian cultural traditions than many of the Egyptians themselves, commissioning temples in the classic pharaonic style and presenting themselves as the legitimate heirs of a tradition they had absorbed through centuries of cultural contact. When Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt in 332 BCE, he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, took on the full titulary of an Egyptian pharaoh, and founded Alexandria, a city that became the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world and home to the famous library and museum. The Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled after Alexander's death maintained the tradition of pharaonic representation while governing in essentially Hellenistic terms, and the extraordinary temple complexes at Edfu, Dendera, and Philae, built or substantially expanded during this period, demonstrate that the artistic and religious traditions of pharaonic Egypt remained productive and vital even as the political context was transformed beyond recognition. What ancient Egypt ultimately represents in the history of human civilization is something more than the sum of its monuments, its dynasties, or its gods. It represents a demonstration of what sustained, purposeful social organization can achieve over enormous periods of time. A civilization that managed to lose and recover its coherence multiple times, to absorb foreign rulers and foreign ideas without losing its essential identity, and to leave behind a physical and cultural legacy so durable that it continues to shape how people across the world understand the past. The Coptic language, which descends directly from ancient Egyptian, is still spoken in liturgical practice across Egypt today, representing an unbroken linguistic thread stretching back more than 5,000 years. The cultural pride that finds expression in modern Egypt, visible in ceremonials accompanying the transfer of royal mummies to the new National Museum of Egyptian Civilization and the reopening of the Avenue of the Sphinxes at Luxor, is not merely nostalgia, but a living relationship with a history that genuinely shapes how Egyptians understand themselves and their place in the world. Archaeological excavations continue to produce discoveries that refine and complicate our understanding of this civilization. And the story of ancient Egypt is by no means a finished story. It is an ongoing conversation between the present and a past so deep and so rich that no single narrative can contain it, and no final word has yet been spoken.